In our study of Galatians, last time we were looking at the allegory that appears in Galatians chapter 4, and you can turn there to Galatians 4 once again. We've been looking at the allegory that's used of comparing the two different women and sons that came from those women of Abraham with the two different covenants. That the one was like the bondwoman Hagar and the son that came from her, who was Ishmael. The other was the free woman, who was Sarah, and her son was Isaac. Ishmael was not the son of promise, Isaac was. Ishmael was the one who came through Abraham endeavoring to work this out according to his own five senses understanding, his own flesh, rather than trusting God to really do the impossible in this situation, because Sarah was barren already and past the age that even a woman that wasn't barren could have had children. And that bondwoman, Hagar, is compared to Mount Sinai and what took place on Mount Sinai with the giving of the law. That giving of the law, that covenant of the law, was not greater than the earlier covenant that had been the covenant of promise given to Abraham. At the same time that Abraham was given the promise that he would have the son of promise, who turned out to be Isaac, he was also promised that righteousness would come through that seed, that promised seed, and he believed that, and he believed unto righteousness, which kind of going back and putting this together with what we learned earlier in Galatians. There's more to this record about the allegory that I'd like to get into. Let's go back, first of all, to pick up where we left off and to kind of get the context to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 26. It says, "But Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all." And that's talking about the Jerusalem that is above, not the present day Jerusalem. The Jerusalem that is above is talking about a future Jerusalem. And it's talking about the Jerusalem that was the promise, the fullness of the promise given to Abraham. Abraham was promised a city, and he looked for a city whose foundation and maker was God. And that fulfillment, the ultimate fulfillment, the real true fulfillment of that promise, wasn't found in the Jerusalem of the time of the writing of Galatians. That Jerusalem didn't even exist in the time of Abraham. But he looked forward to that Jerusalem where righteousness would dwell therein, that Jerusalem that was still to come. That Jerusalem is not the one that was a part of the covenant of the law. It's the one that harkens all the way back to the promise that was given to Abraham, the covenant of promise, not the covenant of the law. Verse 27, Galatians 4. "For it is written, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not, break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath a husband." This verse is a quote from Isaiah 54:1. And in the context, that verse is talking about a nation that's been desolated by the Assyrian army that is represented by the woman without a husband. A nation cannot be barren or have no children, so it's a figure of speech, personification. So looking at that verse, look at it a little closer. For it is written, rejoice thou, barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath more children than she which hath a husband. There's a direct comparison to the situation of those two women that we're looking in detail at that allegory. We had the barren, who was Sarah, and the one that was not barren was Hagar, right? But here, when it says, rejoice thou barren that bearest not, it was talking about Sarah being able to rejoice, although she was barren, and although she had not been able to bear children, because the desolate hath many more children than she which hath a husband. Sarah, who had been barren, in the end, would have children, and greater in number, and greater in terms of the blessings on them, than the one who was able to originally bear, being Hagar. But it also ties in quoting, the reason why that verse is quoted, because then it carries with it not only that comparison of those words to that situation of those two women, but also what's going to happen with Israel. This is a point in time in Isaiah, and the chapter before this was talking about the sufferings of Christ. And this is a time when Israel is in captivity. This is a time when they're in captivity to the Assyrians. And it's talking about that those being that barren nation, this nation in bondage, this nation in captivity, they can rejoice because eventually they will have even greater. And that would be fulfilled again with that new Jerusalem. It looked like at the time of the writing of Isaiah that they were desolate, that the nation of Israel had been forsaken, that the promises that had been given to them of a land and all of those things that were, though they were no longer seemed to be happening or available. But the promise here in Isaiah is for them to rejoice because there was a time coming when Jesus Christ would fulfill all of those promises to Jerusalem. In that covenant, it is through that original covenant of promise to Abraham, and what God promised there and what he elaborated in the future about Israel, and the promises to Israel, and the promises to Jerusalem as the part of representing Israel, that all of that would be fulfilled in the future. That those promises of a city whose would never end, that city wherein righteousness dwelled, that was still going to be fulfilled, and that's what they're encouraged with in Isaiah. Look at verse 28. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. What we've been looking at in this allegory has been a whole, from verses 22 to 27 are all parenthetical. And that's been speaking specifically about Israel, about Judeans. But that comparison isn't just for those that came from that background, but here now in this next verse, it extends all of this, that we, like Isaac, are children of promise. And this again drives home the difference between the two different covenants. The covenant of promise and the covenant of the law, the Mount Sinai, the bondage that came with that. And that we are free just like that child of promise was free. Verse 29. But has then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit? Even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, For the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. And we looked at that. Remember, we looked at the record of Hagar, and after she gave birth to her son, which was Ishmael, that it talked about Ishmael mocking him and then being tossed out. I'd like to go into this a little bit more detail because on the surface that looks like an awfully strong consequence for an awfully minor act. It looks like, boy, all he did was, made fun of his younger brother a little bit, and for that, him and his mother got thrown out. But I told you that that word mocking has a number of different meanings to it, or a number of different ways in which it's used. And I'd like to go into this a little bit for you to understand this. The word mocking comes from the Hebrew word sakhak. That's close to a right pronunciation. The King James Version translates it in the following manner: laugh 6 times, mock 4 times, sport 2 times, and play 1 time. It's a primitive root, and it can mean to laugh outright either in merriment or scorn. And that's interesting because it's that same word that's used both the time that Abraham says that Abraham laughed when he was told that he would be a father when he was past age, and when Sarah was told that she would be a mother when she was past age. Both laughed. And yet if you've read the record and you remember the record, it doesn't seem like God gets it all upset about to Abraham. Then he laughed at the time. But yet Sarah, she gets real concerned and denies that she even laughed when she's questioned about it. And she's reproved for her laughing. But again, you have to judge the ultimate meaning of this word from the context. Because it can be to laugh in merriment, just out of joy, or it can be laughing in scorn, ridicule. And that's the difference between the two parties in this. Abraham's laughter was not one of scorn, it was one of merriment, whereas Sarah's laughter was one of scorn. In Genesis 21, in verse 9, just to recap this from Genesis, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. So mocking, laughing, these again still don't seem to be that big a deal, but let's look at a few other places where this word is used. In Jeremiah 38, and I think you'll begin to see that this word mocking can take on a much stronger and much more sinister usage. In Jeremiah 38, verse 17, then said Jeremiah unto Zedekiah, so we've got Jeremiah the prophet talking to the king here. Thus saith the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, if thou wilt assuredly go forth unto the king of Babylon's princes, then thy soul shall live, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and thou shalt live, and thine house. But if thou wilt not go forth to the king of Babylon's princes, then shall this city be given unto the hand of the Chaldeans, and they shall burn it with fire, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand. So this is at the very end of right before the captivity, and they're about to be taken captive by the Chaldeans. So Zedekiah, without getting into too much of the background of this, Zedekiah's got a choice here. You can either willingly go with these guys, and if you do, this is Zedekiah had not been a good guy. If you do, then you'll be spared, you'll live, and the city won't be burned. Or if you refuse, then you're ultimately not going to live, and the city's going to be burned. That's your choice. Go with them or don't go with them, okay? And you see the consequences if he said, no, I'm not going to go. And yet, look at the next verse. And Zedekiah, verse 19, the king said unto Jeremiah, I am afraid of the Jews that are fallen to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand, and they mock me. But Jeremiah said, they shall not deliver thee. Obey, I beseech thee, the voice of the Lord, which I speak unto thee, so it shall be well unto thee, and thy soul shall live. Given his choice between living and taking the risk that if he goes and surrenders himself, they will mock him, he'd rather take the risk of dying than them mocking him. Obviously, that mocking isn't just, boy, you're an idiot, what a goof you are, right? It obviously has something much stronger in terms of the meaning. It can mean to sport, play, make sport of, toy with, or make a toy of. Okay? Make a toy of. Use in any way that you would desire. And you'll see from some of the other verses the way that it's used, that again, how strong this can be. Look at Genesis 39, verse 13. You're probably familiar with this record. This is the record of Joseph when he is the steward in Potiphar's household, and Potiphar's wife has got the hots for him, and she's relentless in pursuing him. And in the middle of that, verse 13, and it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment, Joseph, okay, so she basically attacks him, and he runs out of there. She's got a hold of his clothes, and he runs out, and she just rips the clothes off of him as he runs out. So there she is. She's got the garment in her hand, and was fled forth, verse 14, that she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. Again, obvious that he's not just making fun of her, right? Obvious that that word mock, to make sport or to use as a toy, to toy with, here is being used in reference to her accusation that he sexually molested her. That's clearly what it's the use of it in this context. Look at Genesis chapter 26, verse 6. And Isaac, now Isaac's the son of promise, right? And this is Abraham's son. And boy, you'll see it's Abraham's son, because in this situation, he's going to borrow a page from Abraham's playbook. And Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked him of his wife. And he said, She is my sister. For he feared to say, She is my wife, lest, said he, the men of this place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. If you know the record, the story of Abraham, this happened twice. Sarah, no matter, she may have been barren, but boy, she had to have been a looker, because two different kings wanted to take her, and Abraham was concerned about it and kept on passing her off as his sister, and then God would tell these guys, that's not just his sister, that's his wife, and then the kings were like freaked out, and that's what happens here. Verse 8, and it came to pass, so he's told all these people, including the king, that this is his sister, right? Verse 8, and it came to pass when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out at a window and saw, And behold, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah his wife. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, Behold, of a surety she is thy wife. And how saidst thou, she is my sister? And Isaac said, Because I didn't want you to kill me trying to get her. He looks out the window and he sees him sporting with his wife. Do you think they were playing badminton and that's why he was convinced that this wasn't his sister? No. Do you think he was teasing her, Oh, look at you, you can't hit as well as Amorite? No, it's obvious that he's not just teasing her or just sporting with her. It's obvious that he had to be doing something very intimate in order for Abimelech to immediately conclude, wait a minute, this is not his sister, this is his wife. That's that same word, sport or mock. It's the same word that's used when it talks about Ishmael mocking Isaac. But also look at Judges, one other record where you see how strong this word can be. In Judges 16, this is the story of Samson. And this is the point in time after Delilah has betrayed him, and he has had his hair cut and broken his vow, and he's taken captive by the Philistines. And they've put out his eyes. And in verse 23 of Judges 16, Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon their god, and to rejoice. For they said, Our God, meaning Dagon, hath delivered Samson our enemy into our hand. Verse 25. And it came to pass when their hearts were merry, that they said, Call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. So, again, the context gives us a good indication of what's going on. And there are clearly situations where this is something extreme. Sometimes it can be obviously of a sexual nature. It could not necessarily always be that. It could be of something where they, again, are just using him, making him a toy to do whatever they want. They've already put out his eyes. What else they did, it doesn't tell us specifically. But you see that it can be something very strong. And again, it's from the context that you determine the shade of meaning. But it isn't just that after whatever happens that Sarah wants Hagar and Ishmael gone. God tells Abraham, yeah, it's right that he is gone. And it is that same specific record that is being referred to when Galatians, quoting those verses basically, says that the older persecuted the younger. So there, rather than mocked, it says persecuted. All right, let's go back to Galatians. Verse 30, nevertheless, cast out the bondwoman and her son. Verse 31. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. We are not children of the bondwoman. And of course, that's being used figuratively. We're not children of the bondwoman or of the free, literally. But in terms of what each one represented there. The one representing the law and bondage, the other one representing the promise by believing. And we are children of the free. We are the ones that are claiming or tapping into that promise that was first given to Abraham, that promise that was fulfilled in Isaac, and through Isaac, that whole bloodline that then ultimately resulted in the birth of Jesus Christ, and we being Christ are heirs to all that was given. Let's go back to Galatians chapter 5. Having gotten through that allegory and the other very lengthy elaboration of the covenants and so forth, we've really gone through the in-depth doctrine that sets forth all the background and just nails down the case from every different way of why we are not under that law. Why we are not under the law. And it's been shown and established from Romans, sometimes using similar examples and in other places using other ones. But by this time, he's so nailed down that we absolutely are not under the law. That we absolutely don't have to do the law, that that's not what it's all about. And so then you arrive at Galatians chapter 5, where it begins with, in verse 1, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." Stand fast, therefore. Therefore. And therefore always indicates that what's being said or about to be said is a result of what has just been stated. And after looking at all this and understanding this, we are to not be again entangled in that yoke of bondage. We are instead to stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. Liberty. Liberty is that freedom to choose. It's that freedom. And that's what liberty is. It gives us the freedom to do what we want. But now we're encouraged to not use that in the wrong way, to not misuse and abuse that liberty. Verse 2, "Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the rest of the ritual law." Oh, no? No. No. Not just the ritual law, not, there are some that would like that somehow still look for some way, why beats me, but still look for some way to put themselves under that yoke of bondage. That still look to put themselves under that law. And so one of the ways that they try to do that is saying, well, all of this is just talking about things like circumcision and the ritualistic law, the observing of sacrifices and fasts and so forth. But if that was the case, then it would say those that are circumcised are debtor to do the rest of the ritualistic law. But it's not. It's talking about the entire law. The entire law. Does that include the 10 Commandments? Yeah, it does. Verse 4, "Christ is become of no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified by the ritualistic law?" No, by the law. If you're justified by the law, if you think you are justified by the law, if you think you are righteous by the law, if you think that your salvation is dependent upon the law, then it says Christ is become of no effect unto you. He accomplished nothing as far as you're concerned. And that's what you're saying when you put yourself under the law. Those that would go back under the law, those that have gone back under the law, they have said that Christ did it for nothing. It said so just in those same words earlier in Galatians, that Christ died in vain. We are to not be entangled again with that yoke of bondage. But we'll see in the next time what we should do instead.